Christ, our true God, send down the grace of thy Holy Spirit upon us and open the eyes of our hearts and our minds to the knowledge of thy gospel, for thou art a good and merciful and men befriending God. Amen. So we're just transferring from one subject to another, and this Sunday, we'll start next Sunday following a new pattern for we're talking about the holy prophets and prophecy in the church, including the New Testament prophets, like Cosmas of Aetolia and Andrew of Constantinople and Seraphim of Sarov, were all New Testament prophets equal to the Old Testament prophets. So, but this time, I want to ask first of all if anybody has any questions about anything, about the faith. You know, it was interesting how many questions came up when we had the memorial service for Luca on Saturday, the one-year service. And people don't really understand what the meaning of the services are and why we have the 3rd, 9th, 40th day of 1 year, especially for Pomana and all. And the Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki, who's our foremost liturgist, and did what we call the Didascalium of the 12 Apostles, which is very ancient writing, that we have the memorial on the 3rd day because Christ rose from the dead on the 3rd day, granting resurrection to everybody. And on the 9th day because the soul cannot be in heaven or hell without the body, can't experience without the body. So they say it's kept by the 9 orders of angels, anyway, the 9th day we serve. Although that's really very ancient and pre-Christian. The 40th day service, we serve because Christ ascended body and soul together into heaven. So we understand that we'll be body and soul together in the heavenly kingdom. Now we know that originally the 40th day originated in Egypt because for the length of time that it takes to embalm a pharaoh is 70 days, and other people, upper class people, is 40 days. So they would mourn for 40 days until the embalming was completed and the burial. But and that's why it says that they mourned for Joseph for 40 days and they mourned for Moses for 40 days. This is according to the practice of the Egyptians. So when we continued to serve those services, we adapted them to the life of Christ. And that's basically 40 days Christ ascended body and soul, so we also will ascend in the flesh, in the resurrected body. Glorified, I might say. But everything, on 1 year time, a widow or widower, after you serve the 1 year service, they take off, in Greece they wear a black armband. Some places they do that, we don't, in Serbia or Russia, but anyway. They wear it for 1 year. And after the fulfillment of the 1 year memorial service, a widow or widower is free to get married without feeling that they've betrayed the deceased spouse. And all these are psychological things because the memorial services are stepping away from grief rituals to help people step away from grief to get on with their life. And yet, not to feel that they've just forgotten the person they loved, who departed. So they're really part of the psychological healing process, the memorial services. And we're not praying somebody from hell to heaven or out of purgatory or any thing like that. It's not. If you listen to the services too, they're speaking to the people who are still alive and grieving and mourning, really. Even the funeral service is primarily for the people who are in grief and are attending the service. That's the main thing, and that's why, of course, unless there's some unique situation, we insist that the coffin has to be open for the funeral service, because we're not serving for the person, we're serving together with the person in it. And the other thing is that if you fall into the fear of death again, it means you're back in the hands of Satan, because Christ ransomed us from fear of death. And it was through fear of death that man was all his lifetime held in bondage by the evil one. So it's the conquest of the fear of death. That's why we say Christ paid the ransom to the grave, paid the ransom to the power of death, because ransom and redemption are metaphors, of course, they're not literal legal terms. And paying the ransom to death delivers from the fear of death, and therefore ransomed us from our bondage to Satan. So bondage to evil, or the evil one. And the services, particularly the funeral service, it's very important that we see how the departed person is included in the service. Not as if we're looking at a box with a cloth over it. We're looking at the person, because we're not disposing of the remains. We're laying in the grave a sacred treasure that was created by God and still beloved by God in it. So if you listen to the prayers, and Dionysius the Areopagite, in his description of the ancient funeral service, he wrote in the early 300s, he says, and of course at that time you had a hierarch, or a bishop in every parish. It was small. He says that the hierarch reads the prayers over the departed, and he's really enunciating the promises, the sure promises of God, assuring the faithful that those promises will surely be fulfilled. And so assuring the faithful who are there for the funeral service in it. And it's, you see all the superstitions that have grown up around us every place, and the sort of fables and mythologies that grow up around it. And people are too literalistic. You know, I won't say rationalist, because, well, rationalism is a problem, using reason is not. You know, we should have, like St. Anthony Kropotkin said about the students in the schools and the seminaries, is you have to teach them critical thinking so they can reason properly. And, but if you're a literalist, then you just have to say, well, if we're not praying them out of heaven, out of hell and into heaven, then why are we saying the prayers, you know? Because people don't understand on the spiritual plane, on the spiritual side, that these services are really there to help the living and grieving get through and try to move away, sufficiently away from grief that they can get on with their life. I think this 1 year service, we had the dacha meal at Gorditch's house, and it's the first time I've seen Clara smile at all since her son was murdered. And it's just that this time and the prayers help her to kind of heal so she can recover. You know, for months afterwards, she had to be on medication constantly on it. And she and Luca were very close. They used to go to the gym to work out together even, the mother and son. And he was such really well loved in the Serbian community. And of course, you know why he was murdered, because he was stalked by a Bosnian Muslim fellow in Whistler, who, when he found out he was Serbian Orthodox, he stalked him and stabbed him to death. So that it was, you know, quite a shock to everyone, all of us. And in a case like that especially, it's so wanton and such a popular young man in the Serbian community that it's very difficult to get through the grief. You know, his father holds himself together better, but you can tell that he's ready to break to pieces at any moment. And getting through the 1 year service, and then having the dacha meal afterward. And we got, well, twice I think we got Clara to smile just a little. But before that she was just frozen in grief. And somehow, if we think about, so many of the divine services have a profound psychological purpose to them, and reason. And they're very often to get people through the grief and sorrow of life. And I want to go back to a subject we touched on before a little bit, and think that one of my early teachers, Father Michael Azkul, a Lebanese theologian, is to say, I don't see why people think sin is the problem. Sin isn't the problem. Sin is only a symptom of the problem. The problem is alienation. And you realize that you have alienation from God, alienation from your neighbor, and far too many people have alienation even from themselves, from their own self. And sometimes our culture and our society force people to be alienated from themselves and to deny who they are. And it's really a kind of emotional homicide in a way, to force people to disconnect and be alienated from themselves. And this is something that's hard for religious people to grasp, because too many religious people think that religion is an absolute. And there are no absolutes this side of the heavenly kingdom. The only absolute is God. There are no absolutes in the human condition. There are only shades of gray. There are no absolutes even in our concepts of morality. Because there's always the economia, you know. That's why the Orthodox Church has economia. You know, a Roman Catholic once asked me, why does the Orthodox Church permit divorce? I said, we don't permit divorce, divorce happens. Well, but you have 3 marriages. They can get married, you know, 2 more times in the church. I said, well, there's a difference between the Latins and the East. In the Latin West, they think they get a divorce, how do we punish them? In the East, they get a divorce, we think, how do we help them work out their salvation under the new circumstances? So we use the principle of economia. So they get married a 2nd time without the crowning, and even a 3rd time. If you're a 3-time loser, you should probably become a monk. You know, it's you know, in some states in the Union, 3-time loser gets life in prison, so why not life in a monastery? You know, but you know, you have to realize if you're a 3-time loser, you're the common denominator in the failures of the marriage. So there's something, you've got a problem. So, but that's kind of the difference. We use economia on these things, but we have to use economia, because even when you hear confession, you know, I mean, we keep reminding people confession is not about coming up and listing a bunch of laws you thought you broke, but sort of unburdening your heart with the things that are weighing you down and giving you grief. It's all about inner human suffering. I mean, the church is a spiritual hospital. Confession is part of the healing process for inner human suffering. So if somebody leaves confession burdened with more guilt than they came there with, then something's wrong with the priest. Because one of the biggest challenges we have in confession is getting people to forgive themselves. And you get God's forgiveness, but forgiving yourself is sometimes more difficult, and you can make yourself sick with this kind of guilt complexes or guilt feelings. And far too much of religion is about making people feel guilty and making children have nightmares at night. But that isn't, that's why I always make a distinction between religion and faith. They're not the same thing. Religion tends to be moved toward becoming an absolute. And whether one likes it or not, the people in ISIS are very religious. But we have people in the Christian world who do the same thing, if we haven't been blessed with secular societies and civil law. Much of the law, I mean, for all that evangelicals say, much of the Constitution in the United States, a good part of it is written to protect people from religious people, from very religious people. And that's why, you know, that we consider fanaticism to be one of the worst heresies in the faith. Everything in moderation. And but the thing is that when we look at the human condition, the human problem, we know that our inner human suffering is more painful than physical suffering much of the time. That includes having an unclean conscience. You know, a healthy conscience is worth more than a healthy body, because an unhealthy conscience can torment one, and you begin to understand what the torments of hell are. It's not a physical, literal torment created by God. It's the torments of your own conscience that make hell for you. You know, the Orthodox Church always held that hell is a psychological condition, that the river of fire is both heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are the same place. And we know that the Fathers taught us that there's no reason to believe that God would love people in hell any less than he loves people in heaven. But it's his love itself that becomes a fire of hell for them because of their conscience. So that's really the nature of hell. But this idea of inner human suffering is something everybody should have thought very seriously about, because often we increase people's inner human suffering. We're not healers, we're wounders. And we make people suffer more than they suffered before because of our own, almost, the only source of hatred is fear. There's no other source for hatred. It's evolutionary. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism where fear turns to hate in order to fight to defend yourself in the ultimate battle for life. But all hatred arises from fear. So when somebody says they have a real intense hatred for someone or some group of people or something, we say, okay, let's forget hatred and try to find out what the fear is that's driving it, the underlying fear. And if you don't stop to think that every human being has this deep inner human suffering of sorts, and this deep torment. Teenagers have much worse than anybody else because of the confusion and chaos and all of the, hormones racing around and stuff. Never mind all of the things you can be born with that make life difficult. This inner human suffering is something that we have to be constantly aware of. And when we're tempted to judge or condemn somebody, we have to think of what kind of suffering are they going through inside, and how is my judgment and condemnation going to make their suffering worse. Sometimes there seems to be this idea that if I preach a really hateful sermon against people, that's going to shock them into repenting. It's far more likely to push them into suicide. And we condemn or tell people something bad about them, and then we try to degrade and humiliate and sort of verbally destroy them or something. We're not doing them a favor, we're not doing God's service or work. That's why everybody should be a healer, and nobody should be a prosecuting attorney. We're not called upon to be prosecuting attorneys. We really are called upon to be spiritual healers. And the only way we can do that is, again, striving for co-suffering love. This is something I repeat too often, perhaps, but there's no other possible way to serve for the spiritual healing or transformation of another human soul except co-suffering love. And if you don't know what co-suffering love is, first of all, enter into yourself and look at your own inner human suffering. And then realize that everybody else is enduring the same thing. And that when you see somebody in some condition that you might think, oh, well, I'm a Christian, so I have to condemn that. Apostle Paul says, who are you to judge, O man, you who do the same thing yourself? That's the thing, is look at your own inner human suffering, and you'll understand the rest of humanity. And if you come to grips with your own inner human suffering, then you can co-suffer with other people. And through co-suffering love, you can heal them and lift them up. And that's really what Christianity is about. It's not about all this stuff here. Not about all the stuff that people shriek, howl, and scream from pulpits and from radios and television stations. It's not even about the stuff that some of our priests preach sometimes, especially the ones who converted from evangelicalism. It's just to stop and think a little bit. What's the problem of humanity? I mean, mankind is essentially good. This generation is better than my generation. A nostalgia is based on a defective memory. It's not based on reality. So I say, oh, it was better when I was young. Okay, pork chops were cheaper when I was young. I could buy a car for less. I could buy a car for a month and a half salary when I was young. But that's about all. The 1950s, when I grew up, were 20 times more materialistic than this generation. And we were the hyper-materialist group coming out of the Second World War, and the economy was booming because everybody was making bombs and military equipment, so there were lots of jobs and salaries were high and all that. So we were so materialistic. And the 60s came along as a rebellion against the materialism of the 50s. But this generation is better than my generation in almost every respect. Less hateful, less prejudice, less dark, less arrogant, and less materialistic. So let's forget nostalgia for what things used to be, or when things were better, when people were more moral, when they behaved better, or any of that stuff. It's absolutely not true. But think about your own struggle in life, and think about the things that go on in your mind, and don't ever use the word normal, because everybody's got some screws loose rattling around inside their head. And we're all nuts. None of us are totally sane. So we've got to see that, so what we've got in life is really, it's sort of like a scale, where the tips this way or tips that way. And very, very seldom is a scale right in the middle. We're all to one side or to the other side. On the far side of it, psychiatric disturbances are more visible, but they exist in this whole spectrum and all that. So alienation, what we call, I don't like the word sin because it's so misused, In the East, sin doesn't mean guilt, it only means guilt in the West, because that's the way it was translated to Latin. It just means missing the mark or falling short of the goal, and the mark or the goal is union with God. It's not having a perfect life or being able to walk on water or float in the air. It's union with God, which is impossible if you don't have any sense of unity with your fellow human beings. And this is basically the only thing I wanted to cover before next week. I'll put on the Facebook a guide for what we're going to study in the Holy Prophets. And, we have to use some terms that most people don't come across, like how the great prophets in Israel developed in the Great Axial Period, what's called the Great Axial Period. We'll talk about that later. But there was this era in time when people were grasping their personhood, and then they were starting to think about social justice. And the thing is almost always missed that all of the great prophets in the Old Testament, they were all deeply concerned with social justice. All of them were concerned with social justice. And the things that were revealed, sometimes in strange ways, like Ezekiel besieging a brick in the middle of the road, or running around naked and dragging stuff behind him and all, or Prophet Ossi, or Hosea, as I did say. I think of Jose to be the only Mexican in the Bible, but it's Hosea. So why does he marry a temple prostitute? Why is God wanting to marry a temple prostitute? It's simple, because Israel has become a prostitute. But what's the real key to it? What's really being said here, see? The covenant is not a legal agreement. The covenant is a spousal relationship. This is not about law. This is about love. It's a spousal relationship. And God is always the faithful spouse, and Israel is so often the unfaithful spouse. So go and marry a temple prostitute, because that's what Israel has become. She's abandoned her spouse and become a temple prostitute. And and of course, when Gomer goes back into temple prostitution after she's married to Hosea, God tells her, go redeem her back again for what, an omer of barley and a measure of oil. And why? Why? Because of love. What other reason would there be? The same reason I'm standing here waiting for Israel to come back, instead of abandoning her. Because I love her, because she's my spouse. So the whole thing is reviewed. It's a spousal relationship. We should never think in terms of law or legal agreements. So, in any case, I'm probably going to leave it at that for this time, because if you look on the Facebook Orthodoxy in the 21st century, I'll have the sort of outline of what we're going to take. Now we'll go through all of the Holy Prophets. We finished the Apostles, and we finished the New Testament, and now we'll go through the prophets in particular. So, anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Lazar, what happens with us after we passed away? What happened with us, with our souls?
Well, all that we're actually told, we put aside all of our fables and mythologies and superstitions. We Eastern European, we got a lot of superstitions. But all that we're ever told is kept by the 9 orders of angels until the general resurrection. We always talk about They say partial judgment because only a part of the person is there. You know, the Holy Father say if you look on the body of a person, you can't say this is the person, but only a part of a person. If you looked upon the soul of a person, you couldn't say this is the person, but only a part of the person. Because as St. Photius the Great says, that man consists in the soul and the body linked together in one form with the beautiful, the complete person in it. So the soul is simply kept by the 9 orders of angels until the resurrection. And nothing really going on. But partial judgment just means that when you depart this life, your intellect is part of the soul, so you know where you stand. So it's your conscience is the one who judges. You know, look at St. Cyril of Jerusalem in his catechetical lectures where he said in the Last Judgment, just don't think that God's going to sit behind a desk with books reading people's sins. So your conscience is going to judge you instantly when you come face to face with the love and glory of Jesus Christ, and your judgment is going to be in relationship to his love. And so St. Abba Isaac and St. Abba Ephraim, the Syrians, they both say, I think it's Ephraim who says that, he talks about somebody asking about justice, but they're talking about juridical justice, not real justice. You know, justice is setting things back in balance, a rebalancing situation. But when they talk about justice, judgmental justice, he said that, look, justice is like a few grains of sand tossed into the great ocean of God's mercy. So, and both Abba, Isaac, and Ephraim, in different times and different ways, tell us the sin that burns the most deeply like a flame is the sin against love. Because no sin burns more deeply than the sin against love, as when a spouse betrays a spouse, or even when your best friend betrays you, or a friend betrays a friend. Because it's a sin against love, it burns more deeply than other sins. That's why sin shouldn't be thought of so much as guilt, because we don't get the perspective. If you are married, falling short of the mark means not being loyal to your spouse. If you're a friend, falling short of the mark means betraying your friend or not being a true friend. And that's a sin. Anybody else before we? Okay, then check. I'll try to have by Tuesday. I'll try to have the outline of when we start the Holy Prophets.
Christ is risen from the dead, trembling down death by death, and upon those in the tomb bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trembling down death by death, and upon those in the tomb bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trembling down death by death, and upon those in the tomb bestowing life. Glory to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and ever, and wait for the ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Vladika bless.
God is with us by his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and unto ages of ages.